within grace, like giving people grace to make study, but also things like discipline and like just all of those things.
Yeah, I don't think grace negates boundaries. I mean, actually, I think it's more graceful to have them than to not, because people are clear about what they're responsible for and what they're not. A lot of times we seem to we seem to play the grace card on everything that we're uncomfortable about, and usually like saying no and making somebody else uncomfortable is another kind of I'll just give them grace, which is just basically saying I don't want to have any boundaries with them. So I think those are very much fold together. I don't think we think of them that way at all. I think we think of boundaries as being kind of a cruel thing or mean thing. But I think making a world that is more understandable, more predictable is a loving thing to do with people, and that's what boundaries allow us to do. So most of the time people don't have boundaries because they don't understand the concept, and they think they do. So, and usually they have a distorted view of it. So yeah, I mean, I think that, and there's a lot of misunderstanding, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in coming weeks, but or even just around grace and how do we experience it. Kyle Idleman gives you a little bit of a bird's eye view. I want to give you a different one. Because I think the church is really good at talking about grace in terms of our salvation. It really sucks when it comes to talking about grace when it comes to living with each other, and that's what I want to spend the time talking about. So I'm not going to be talking about it theologically. If you want that, go up on the second floor, and then stop by my office to decompress on the way back. So so anyway. Yeah, hopefully that answers you. Any other questions? Yeah.
I kind of talked about this a little bit in my journal too, but I just want to know, give you an example. So like at my youth group, like one of the girls like told some like personal information about like insecurities.
Yeah.
And then like a bunch of like my youth girls were like at the ready with like Bible verses.
Oh Lord. Yeah.
How like by the end like she was crying, so I like pulled her aside and talked. Resolved. But in that like setting, how do I like kind of navigate the group setting of like without shaming them for their like wanting to help? If that makes sense. Like,
yeah. Yeah, and I think you've got kind of the answer embedded in what your question is, because I think we can affirm the intent. Yeah. The intent is wanting to help. The question is this what this person needs right now? And sometimes you have to find a way to give that person a voice. And they won't, particularly when you're in a group setting, a lot of times we silence ourselves and then we blame everybody else for not listening. And so sometimes as a group leader, you might, you could look at her as they're doing a dog pile of, Bible verses, and you can look at the kid and say, "Is this really helping?" And if she says the polite, "Oh yeah, no, tell me the truth," and then she can say, "No, it doesn't," and then you've got an opportunity to teach about our help is calibrated against the other person's need. It always will be. And that's a really important lesson to teach. Middle schools middle schoolers?
It's high schoolers.
Yeah, well, either way. That's a really nuanced way of understanding things. It can be learned, though. It can be learned. But, I mean, even high schoolers, the funny thing about it is if somebody did that to them, they would take their head off. But yet, that's the first thing they do to their friends. Not that happens here at all, right? So, hang on a sec. Are you raising your? Yeah, okay. Not that I do that. We're not in one of those meetings at all, right? So, I mean, I think particularly when you're being a group leader with kids of that age, there are teaching opportunities everywhere if you can just be attuned to it and allow something to happen, knowing that it's probably going to happen, and then call in time out and say, now let's back up a second. Let's talk about what just happened here. And that's the stuff that sticks in kids' minds because they don't learn in the moment. They always get upbraided later about it. And nobody learns there because usually what's there is shame. But you can put grace on display by allowing people to learn in the moment. So that's the funnest part. For me, and the dirty little secret, that's why I like groups so much. Because there is so much learning that can be done because people try and don't quite get it, and then they have an opportunity to see how to do it differently. You're not going to do that in a one-on-one conversation with somebody, usually. So you got some huge opportunities, no pressure, of course. So, yeah.
Okay, so how do we at CCU,
Uh-oh.
if that ever happens, but
No.
100% does, how do we go about, I guess, explaining to our lovely friends who don't understand that I don't want to hear a Bible verse right now, I just want you to be my freaking friend. How, in a much nicer way than that.
I was going to say, that's pretty good.
They're going to respond to me because I tried to explain that to someone and they're like, well, it's the Bible, it's true, so like, why wouldn't you want to hear it? And I'm like,
I feel better right now, so
Yeah.
shut up.
yeah, but then...
That. Call Emily over. Here, say it. Sick 'em. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I. No, I.
Responsive to that.
No, and I mean, a lot of times the best feedback isn't necessarily in the moment. So now I'm switching from what I just said to her, because a group setting is very different. There's forces in a group that make learning possible in a very short period of time. In one-on-one relationships, you don't have that same kind of force going on. And so, to some degree, if you can get it registered in your head when it happens and kind of log for yourself what you're feeling, what they're saying, so forth, then loop back around and say, can we talk about that interaction again? And see, then they don't feel like they're powering up to defend themselves by what you're saying to them, but you're giving helpful feedback. Now, we've already spent time talking about safe people and what safe people do with feedback and what unsafe people do with feedback. And the thing that I want you to make sure you keep in your mind is all of those personal traits and all those interpersonal traits. Those are not meant to label anybody. They are to equip you to help to discern the kind of people that you're in relationship with. That's all. Your job is not to label somebody as being unsafe. Do not label them to their face as unsafe. I'm glad I got it said. And to some degree, don't change what you're doing to be safe yourself. I mean, that's really hard with people that are unsafe, but I think at a later point in time, you're saying to yourself, I need to rethink the boundaries with this person and where I am in this relationship with them. I calibrate distance in or whatever. Yeah. Any other questions or anything? That looks half-hearted.
Kind of on the subject, kind of transitioning. I was talking to my friend and I was like, I'm reading in 1 Samuel stuff right now, and I was like, David's such a cool dude and whatever, but I like to see he's like a man after the Lord's heart. and stuff we hear all the time.
Right.
And I'm like, that's really cool for David, but I don't think that, like, I have a really hard time applying that concept of grace to myself that the Lord has for him. And this friend who's like very wise was talking to me, and she was talking about how in the Old Testament, like, their faith was counted to them as righteousness, and I went then from there to Romans and was reading in chapters 4 through 6, and my brain like exploded because just seeing Christ as like the ultimate empath and the ultimate restorer of connection and protector of relationship, like I think a lot of times our friends who are Christians and who have the best of intentions behave in ways that feel very ungracious and very unsafe. But really, like, to go over these passages and see how Christ is like such an incredible like bridge between us and the Father. I've never all over these 2 pages of my Bible is like these crazy underlines and like arrows and like references to like daring greatly and all this stuff, and it was so beautiful to see that example of Christ and like that view him in that way, as opposed to something that is inherently like feels different because of the culture that we're in.
Yeah.
And it like blew me away. Just saying, like, anyone, if you're like thinking about Jesus and grace, and like just check out Romans, it exploded in my head this week.
Yes. So make a connection for me. You started talking about David and you ended in Romans with Jesus.
Yeah.
Connect those, please.
I was like, see how like the Lord talks so much about righteousness and how we're supposed to be righteous, and I was like, it's just hard because I feel like that's such a works-based system. And my whole life and like growing up in the church, we're like conditioned to behave in like good instead of bad.
Right.
And I was like, it's frustrating because I'm trying to operate within grace, but I feel like growing up, it's all been about works.
Sure.
And whether those are actual works or just where your heart's at, it's still about like righteousness versus unrighteousness. And so that's kind of how she bridged that gap.
I see.
Well, let's talk about
Okay.
what that looks like.
Yeah, the interesting thing about it is I sometimes I think we've never heard the other definition of righteousness. Have you heard me say this before? Anybody else heard me say this before? I don't even remember if I've said it before. We think of righteousness as holiness, or I don't know what we think of it as. Almost perfection. And I did a study many years ago on that, and what I found is that righteousness actually carries with it this connotation of being rightly related. So being righteous isn't being right all the time. Being righteous is a quality of being rightly related to God. And so, the remarkable thing about David is that, he was pre-Jesus, he was pre-New Covenant, and yet he was, God described him as a man after his own heart. But think about what an incredibly checkered life David had. So the question is why would God label somebody like that, so fallen, so broken, as somebody after my own heart? And I think it has something to do with how David cared for his own. I think it had something to do with that. And because God resided in that heart of his, and he pursued and cared for it, and by doing so was rightly related to God. And I think there's something to that. Because, I mean, you look at David and you put out his resume. It's not real good. He was a terrible father. He was an adulterer. He shed a lot of blood. It was the very reason why he didn't get to build the temple. And yet God is still saying, this guy is after my heart. The remarkable thing about David that you see in the Psalms, if you read them really carefully, is this is a man that's willing to descend into the depths of his heart and meet God there. And I think that's where the relationship comes from. It's also one of the reasons why, given shame, we don't go there. And therefore, we wonder why we feel isolated and distant from God. So, for what it's worth category, I suppose. Any other questions or thoughts or anything? Okay, let me just do a real quick poll, okay? How many of you guys have heard the boundaries material I talk about? How many of you guys? Wow, there's more of you that have never heard this before. Okay. Are you guys willing to put up with hearing it again? Okay. So let's do this. I want to go through that stuff, and then and if we have time, we'll end on it and send you off thoroughly uncomfortable, because we'll talk about control. So, given that introduction, yeah. No shame at all, Emily. No shame. No shame. Get some more for us or whatever. Okay. So those of you who have never seen this material before, it'll be new. Those of you who have, you can yawn and do whatever you want to waste the time. But the last I checked, the people that hear this boundary stuff the second time always hear something a little bit different because your relationships are different. So, yes, ma'am.
Is this from the Boundaries book, or is this your own?
Yes and yes.
Lit. I was talking about it with my mentor last night, and she was asking me about that.
Yeah, the background to this is that myself and two other friends of mine wrote at the same time John and Henry did the book for Boundaries. We did a devotional, they did the book. And so a lot of this stuff that you're going to hear is the backbone of it is Boundaries stuff. The rest of it is my stuff. So much for dodging that bullet, huh?
I came back.
I know you did.
If I'm going to correct, I got to be able to rehydrate myself.
Of course you do. All right. Well, on that point, let's pray. Father, thanks for the opportunity we have to be together and to look through our relationships and to always keep reminding ourselves of what you have given us that we can't ever afford. That also gives us the freedom to learn new ways of responding and relating. To be redemptive people in the world, that we can respond in a different way, and people are changed just by the response and by how we relate. So give us that wisdom and also just the courage, as Brene Brown talks about, the ordinary courage to speak from our hearts fully. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So, let me show you a video clip, just to give you background. And again, some of you guys have heard this pitch before. I used to work at a church. There was a church plant from a bigger one in Illinois, here in Colorado. I was the teaching pastor. And we had a fairly wild crew of production people. And I was doing a sermon series on The Secrets of Life, and they came up with this little video. And this really is a look in at the craziness of production people. And so I gave them this kind of call and said, all right, give it a shot, see what you come up with. And they created this video, and the video wasn't really meant to be about boundaries, but it's all about boundaries. And it's also about the follow-up subject of control. So I killed two birds with one stone. Here it is. Going. Well, it was.
Is made possible by a grant from the Fake British Accent Guild and viewers like you. Meet Greg Samaritan, a man like many men in this world, occasionally feeling the pressure of living up to the standards put upon him by his father and his father's father and so on. Or does it go deeper than that? We recently sat down with Greg and asked him about his heritage.
I am of the direct lineage of the Good Samaritan. Actually, my great grandfather was the Good Samaritan that Jesus talks about in the Bible. The story goes that a man was beaten and robbed by the side of the street and left to die. My great grandfather then came upon this man on the side of the road and decided to help him.
Hey, Grandma.
I'm sorry, I can't help it. Just saw this kind of messy right here.
Being a good Samaritan at all times to all people, it turns out, can become quite taxing.
I'm basically a nice guy. I care about others. But I like a little time for myself. That's good. You know? Because every day I'm doing at least 4 or 5 good deeds when I could be enjoying my time other ways. I guess it's in my blood. I don't really have a choice. I find myself in situations where I need to help others, and I oblige. I follow what my great grandfather did before me. No problem. I've got some time, and I love to help. So, actually, you know what? She was before me. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Seriously, go ahead. Yeah, no problem. I don't even know what I want yet. If I could just have one day a week where I could be selfish and worry about me, have some me time, you know, and take the phone off the hook. Because people call me all the time wanting to... Hold on a second. Sorry. I've got to take this. Hello? Oh, hey. No, that's no problem. I'll be right there. It's my friend Tom, and he's moving today.
I decided it was time to challenge some of Greg's assumptions about his heritage.
Have you ever heard of a parable?
Sure.
It's a story that Jesus often told to make his point. And from what the Bible says, the Good Samaritan is a parable. It's a story.
What are you saying?
Well, it's a story that Jesus told. It's not something that actually happened in the Bible per se. Are you aware that that's true?
Hold on. Are you trying to tell me that my great grandfather is not a real person? Do you want to see my driver's license? It says Greg Samaritan. it's my last name.
And all this time, you could have been doing what you wanted to. You chose to do good deeds.
You know what? I choose to end this interview. This interview's over. Do you want some tea or anything? I have some cold cuts. I could make you a sandwich.
It wasn't easy for him to hear, but Greg chose to move on with his life and forever put away the assumption that he must, by blood, be a good Samaritan. Our film crew caught up with Greg a week later to follow his progress.
Greg, Mr. Samaritan.
No cameras.
Mr. Samaritan.
No cameras. Get that out of my
I
face.
just want to take a picture. Just a picture.
You'll see what I'm really like.
Welcome to Jericho.
Yeah, that's pretty much how crazy they can get. The thing that I want to highlight for you is a number of things in there of what tends to motivate our behavior in terms of our beliefs about who we are. And that erodes a lot of boundaries in a lot of cases. So the things that we say yes to isn't so much because we are actually motivated or choosing to do it. We feel obligated because we're Christians. Just like he was as the descendant of the Good Samaritan. And he was always doing stuff. And in a lot of ways, from a boundaries point of view, he was doing stuff that nobody asked him to do. Of course, people were more than happy to do that. If you ever feel like that's always the case and people are always calling you for something to do, it might not be because they're so needy. It might be because you may have trouble saying no. So in the physical world, at least, we've got lots of examples of boundaries. Fences and walls and all sorts of things. Moats, I don't know if anybody has a moat, but the point of it is why do we have these? Why do we have these? Yes?
This might be a really bad question to ask, but I was talking about intercultural ministry minor.
Yes.
I was in one of those classes just now, and just out of curiosity, have there been people who have looked at individualist cultures like America, we're very into private property, fences, walls, moats. We are this is my space, this is my time. If you invade my space and my time, you don't respect me.
Mm-hmm.
But versus collectivistic cultures where they some of them don't have any concept of private property. Have anybody looked at concept the idea of boundaries in individualistic versus collectivistic cultures?
Not specifically. It is thoroughly a Western concept, for sure. I mean, being in an Eastern culture, the whole idea, even of physical space, is very, very, very different. Yeah. If you've ever rode the subway in Tokyo, you know what I mean. So, and women in particular, it's even worse. So, there's a lot of distortions around that, but this concept very much is within a Western context. It is not an Eastern context at all. You're right. The individualistic cultures, private property and personal property, personal space, we put far higher value on it than people in another, like you say, collectivistic culture. So, yeah, it's very much rooted in our personal culture.
So, I mean, if you had to wager a guess, oh wait, we can't wager.
Of course.
If you had to wager a guess,
I would, but whatever.
Would you say that there are some detrimental effects in collectivistic culture as a result of kind of not having this concept of boundaries and because even fate for them is a very collectivistic experience.
Right.
And, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
No.
And it's not necessarily a good thing to be individual. But,
sure.
If you had to guess, do you think that there are detrimental effects?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's the honor-based cultures, face-saving kinds of cultures. To us, looks like the people are lying to you most of the time. Now, what's interesting about that is even as Westerners, we have our own way of saving face. It's just not embedded in our culture like it is there. Partly because of family honor and cultural honor and things like that. So it is detrimental in the sense that it is culturally embedded there. Yeah, it's not as embedded here in the United States or in the Western countries. And so you could say that's detrimental. The richness even of the community culture, the collectivistic culture, in regards to understanding how to function as that, is far richer in the Asian countries than it is here. We have to fight the individualistic nature of, get out of my face. You have no business telling me what I can do or what I can't do. That's not necessarily the case there. They do have a right to do that because it reflects on everybody, not just the person. So, it's impossible to land on calling something detrimental when somebody has done nothing but grown up in that environment. And is there honesty in those environments? Yeah, there still is. There still is. And the whole idea of boundaries is still applicable. I've talked to people from Asian cultures before about boundaries, and it's pretty freeing to them. It's embedded in different ways in their culture than it is in ours. Ours is almost codified into law and into intellectual property and all other places that we just don't even think about. In theirs, they have to be a whole lot more intentional about respecting boundaries, for example. But there's enough connectedness that they can have. They're more in tune to paying attention to each other than we are. We have to really be pretty intentional about that, because we tend to kind of live our own little silos and kind of come out now and again to have a conversation and go back in and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean that's even a bigger kind of conversation when we talk about it in terms of different cultures within the world, period. And it's a fascinating one, but it's certainly a bigger one. So the one of the reasons that we have this, and it's true in any culture really, but particularly here, one of the reasons my question was, why do we have fences and walls? To mark out what I'm responsible for. That's why we have those fences. I mean, fences, they're everywhere here, all right? And why? Because they mark the boundary lines of property that somebody is responsible for. And outside of that, they're not responsible for that stuff. Inside of it, they are. Okay? So, and we do that everywhere, really. Now, even if homeowners don't share a fence, they both know where their boundary line is. I mean, I had a neighbor in Illinois. We had no fences between our yards, but we both knew where our property line was and never mowed beyond it. And even if I did, they didn't care anyway. Happy to have one less thing to mow. But at the same time, it was very much a part of that. So in Scripture, they talk about it as the idea here is boundaries define our soul. And the Proverbs 4:23 verse is one that I like to spend a lot of time talking about, partly because it's talking about the wellspring of life. And interestingly enough, and a lot of you guys have been in Transformational and heard me talk about this when we talk about the Sermon on the Mount, we spend more time worrying about what comes out of that well and downstream into people's lives than we do paying attention to the well. And boundaries define what we are responsible for about that well. All right? Translate your heart. And that's what boundaries do. It helps me to know what I'm responsible for. The second thing is it tells me what's me and not me. So you are the only one that is an expert on your emotions. No one else is. I am the only one that's the expert on mine. If I don't know them very well, that's my business. It's not yours. Now, On occasion, I can avail myself of a friend or a counselor or somebody and spill out what's going on in this well of mine, and they'll start helping me to identify what's mine. But boundaries define what's me and what's not me, and what I'm responsible for and what I'm not. So when the writer of Proverbs says a heart knows its own bitterness and no one shares its joys, no one else can experience joy like you can. Nobody else can experience bitterness like you can. It is uniquely yours. And boundaries help us be clear about what that is. The other aspect that we have to bring in here when we're talking about boundaries is what we call to and for. In other words, how am I responsible to somebody versus how am I responsible for somebody? And these set of verses in Galatians 2 through 5 betray that. Because Paul says at the very beginning, he says, bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. I call this the boulders and backpacks verse. Because burdens is literally translated boulders. A crushing weight that is so big, so crushing, that the person cannot possibly carry it alone. And therefore, I'm called to bear a burden with them. In other words, for them. I'm responsible for them. Okay? And I'm there to carry it with them, if you will, but also to carry it for them for a time. You go farther down where he says, for each one should bear his own load. People read those two verses and think he's talking about the same thing. He's not. Because this word that's rendered here in English, load, literally is knapsack in Greek. In other words, a backpack. Because you walk around with your backpack on your backs and you carry everything in there that you need for your daily living. Glasses, water bottle, all the other things that you carry with you, food, etc. It's nobody else's. How much panic do people feel if they were to confuse their backpack with somebody else's, besides whatever surprises they might find there? So, being responsible to somebody is also understanding that every person has their own backpack. And so my job is to understand, is it a boulder or a backpack? And I've had lots of people that are carrying boulders and shame themselves into believing that it's a backpack. And if I'm responsible and I understand kind of the differences between these things, then one, I have to say, no, that's a burden and let me help you with it. Or how do I be responsible to them to say, that's something you need to really try to do on your own. So there's a difference between being responsible for somebody. So let me give you another example. If you say something to someone that is honest, they say, hey, you want to go out and go to a movie or whatever, and you don't feel like going. You don't want to go. Okay? And you say, no, not tonight. I'm not up for it. And they get hurt, and they start manipulating, and they start saying, you don't like me anymore? In not so many words. And then we finally cave in. We are being responsible for their emotions. It is not our business. It is their emotions. Now, it doesn't mean you have to be mean, but at the same time, we can lovingly remind the person, my preferences has nothing to do with your worth. People that don't want to take no for an answer are violators of boundaries. And so being responsible to somebody is being honest with them about what I can and won't do. Okay? There's a lot of times, myself included, that somebody asks me to do something or whatever, and I don't say, no, I really would rather not do that tonight. I say what? Sorry, I can't do that. And the reality is, it's not that I can't. I mean, I had an old friend of mine who used to say, the only thing you can't do is fly, and the only thing you will do is die. Everything else is a choice, in other words. And in a lot of our language with people, we're convinced that they won't accept our no without us making it an imperative. I can't do it, rather than I'm not up for doing that tonight, because it's a choice, and so if we anticipate the person feeling bad because we say no, and they have nobody to go see the movie with at all, then we're now being responsible for them, again, for their emotions, versus being responsible to them. Like I said, being responsible to people is honest. It's honest. And the reality is that if we cultivate that kind of relationship, we're cultivating a relationship for intimacy. Because what is really is. If I say something that I don't mean, I'm cultivating a dishonest relationship. Because they'll just think that I always want to do that. And then when I don't, they get hurt or they feel like, they've been betrayed or whatever that might be. So the fourth thing is it keeps the good in and the bad out. The best fences have a gate in them. And you're the only gatekeeper of your heart. Nobody else is. You're the only one that gets to say what comes in and what doesn't. Now, there are plenty of people in our lives, who are self-appointed gatekeepers. And they tell you that they're allowed in because of whatever status they have. Family member, whatever. Okay? But you have a right to be the gatekeeper of your heart, because it is the wellspring of life. And that word guard is the same word that's used to guard the king's treasures. It's the same word that Solomon is using in Proverbs. So all fences need gates. If there is no gate, it's a prison. And you're trapped. So having boundaries is not about having walls. Boundaries are not about separating us. They're about defining us. Do they separate us from somebody? Yes, they do. But it is not an offensive weapon. It's not even a defensive weapon. It is simply a statement of reality that I'm separate from you. People that have this tendency to not have many boundaries and end up fusing with people lose themselves in the other person. And intimacy is not possible when you're fused with somebody else, because you're fusing with yourself. And this is the key, all right? And you'll hear, I say this at every wedding I officiate. You can't give away what you don't own. Boundaries allow me to own myself, and when I do that, I can actually give it away. If I don't, then I have nothing to give away. Yeah, Lauren?
So where's the line between shutting people out because you don't want them to hurt you, you're guarding your heart, but then letting people...
Well, I mean, you kind of defined the groups of people that we keep out, right? I mean, the people that we know and we've had history with that are going to, contaminate the well, I should keep the gate closed. And the people that aren't, I should let in.
But people are still, they still fail us.
Who still fails us?
Everyone, we're human.
Everyone?
Yeah.
Well, that is the chance you take. That's one of the reasons why I talk about safe people first before I talk about this. Because safe people equips you to discern at the gate who to let in and who not to. Now, it doesn't mean every time you let somebody in who's reasonably safe, that they'll never fail you. Of course they will. But if they're the safe people that we were talking about, and I give them feedback, they're probably going to calibrate their behavior on that. And the other thing is safe people, when they come to the gate, you know, it's one thing that they do. Oops, sorry. They knock. They say, "Can I come in?" Safe people do that. I'm probably freaking out the choir over there. They probably can't hear me either. You know, interesting story was told about Billy Graham. You all know who I mean when I say Billy Graham, right? Ruth Graham Lotz was one of his kids, and she recounts the story of her dad. And her dad had 3 rules in their household. And he referred to them as the 3 Ps: privacy, property, and person. Okay? She recounts a story where she's in her room, door is open, and she's upset about something. She doesn't recall, at least what I remember from her telling of the story. And her dad came to check on her. And literally, he came to the threshold of the door, knocked on the door jamb, and said, "Is it okay if I come in?" That's a person who understands about boundaries. Think about that metaphorically. And people in our life who think they are entitled to come in, don't knock, don't ask, and then say, "Why are you getting so upset?" and blaming you. And see, that's why boundaries is such a big, big issue. This is why I talk about it as much as I do. Because if you want to have a healthy relationship, you better have boundaries. And if you're in a relationship or have been in a relationship with somebody who doesn't respect your no, it's time to reevaluate. Because people who respect your no, it's a pretty good clue that they're going to be safe. So, you know, they ask, "What, are you upset?" "Yes, I am upset." "Do you want to talk about it?" "No, I don't." Nobody's ever said that in this room, right? Safe people say, "Okay." Now, that accomplishes 2 different things. On the one hand, it accomplishes communicating to you that your words matter. Okay? That's the beauty of it. Because having good boundaries and somebody accepting no, you say no, they take your no, and you mean yes. In other words, if you love me enough, you'd know that I mean yes, so you can come in anyway. There's accountability to that, right? They say you say no, they say okay, and they go on about their business, and you're saying, "Ouch, that hurt. They should have." They should have known. Should is, a second cousin to shame. But it holds me accountable because then I say, "Oh, so if I say yes, they'll come in." What a revelation. And if I say no, they don't. Words matter. And in relationships and in boundaries, words matter. So when you say something, I take you at your word. If you have some little measure in your head that says, if you really loved me and cared about me, you would be able to divine what I mean and then do what I need, then somebody's not taking responsibility for their needs. It ain't me. Because somebody's not helping me to know what those are. So, some other examples of boundaries. Skin, obviously. Words, I've already said. Probably the most profound boundary word in our vocabulary is the simplest one that we never like to say. No. Speaking the truth. Geographical distance. There are plenty of people that it's a pretty good idea to get as far away from them as possible. And that's the geographical, finding literal distance. Time can be a distance too. I need a break. A lot of times we'll say that. So all of those are within this area of boundaries. Now let me identify 4 different boundary problems people tend to have. All right. The first one is this. These are people that we would refer to as being compliant. This is Greg. He says yes to everything. He says yes even to things that are bad for him. And these folks have very fuzzy, indistinct boundaries. They tend, and this is a key. They minimize the differences that they have with others. You know why? Because they mistake intimacy with being the same as. And intimacy is not possible if we're not separate. So they do everything they can to minimize the differences that they have with anybody else. And so they're always trying to create similarities because that's really the only way to remain connected. This is one of those places that Brene Brown is right on the money in terms of what drives this behavior is the fear of disconnection. That's what drives this behavior. It's not just fear globally. It's the fear of disconnection. And so they twist themselves into 1,000 little knots on behalf of somebody else just so they won't feel disconnected from them. And that's the compliance in the group. The second group is referred to as the avoidance. Now, the compliance say yes to everything bad, and avoidance say no to everything good. In other words, somebody offers to help them, and they say, no, it's fine. I got it. It's just fine. And usually the motivation behind that is they always relativize their problem to somebody that has it worse than them. And it's like, do you need help pushing your cart? No, it's fine. Somebody else doesn't have one. I don't know what I'm complaining about. At least I've got one to push. And they seem to have this inability to ask. And for them, boundaries are walls. They separate them from other people. Now, the other thing underlying this that is not up here is what drives avoidance. Okay? And a lot of, in your reading of the Daring Greatly and the Brene Brown stuff, a lot of paths all run back to connection and belonging. For them, they don't want to appear dependent or obligated, because then they are tied to whoever that other person is because they think in contracts. So if I say yes, all right, this is the thinking of an avoidant. The reason I know it so well is I've been the poster child for this one for a long, long time. And the reason I don't say yes is because then I am obligated to do the same for the other person. If then. If they do it for me, then I've got to do it for them. Yes, Abby?
Can you do both?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
One person is
No,
one of these.
there you go.
Or
No,
mixtures.
or we're all mixtures. The funny thing about it is, a lot of times we can be one in more social relationships and a different one in intimate relationships.
And you just do both the toxic tendencies.
Well, you can do that too. Yeah, right. Keep them guessing. Keep them on their toes. That way they'll stick around because they're always waiting for the reveal. So, yeah. Here's another one. The controllers. This group is more of what we have to talk about later, but the controllers, the overall group themselves is that they don't respect other people's boundaries at all. They don't accept no for an answer. The difference is there are two subgroups. There is two subgroups underneath this. There are those that don't take no for an answer and they intimidate and dominate to change your no to a yes. There are others that don't take no for an answer and they cajole, persuade, manipulate, and other things to get that no to change anyway. Either way, no is not acceptable. In other words, they're asking you to take responsibility for them. 2 and 4, remember the prepositions. And they tend to project responsibility onto everyone else. So they're trolling for people to do things for them. And if they can't, then they'll intimidate them into doing it. So the subgroup, the first subgroup, is ones we call the aggressive controllers. And they don't listen. They intimidate. They run over fences. And if they don't get their way, they tend to escalate. And they become more verbally abusive. In the ultimate scenario, they become physically intimidating, dominating, physically abusive. And as I've said, there's no place for no. No one is entitled to say no. It's interesting to watch in a lot of ministries that I've been a part of, particularly ministries that depend on volunteers. And the people that are recruiting the volunteers oftentimes are people like this. They don't take no for an answer. So it's a dangerous line to walk, because we can still recruit people. But one of the things I've learned over the years in terms of boundaries and the importance of all of them is there's one phrase I tend to say all the time, particularly when I request something of someone. Okay? And that's even true, particularly true now that I'm in this position. Okay? Because being a professor, there's some measure of power that I think is ridiculously stupid, but that's me. But the thing that I will often say, and either I have to remind people of, is that if I ask them to do something, I will say, no is an acceptable answer. You're allowed to say no. And I do that for the very reason to trigger their freedom to say no and to be honest. And that's part of this, and it's part of the other thing that we'll talk more about when we talk about the whole control kind of issue. But they aren't even aware that people have boundaries. And really, generally, whenever I try to teach this, I can always tell the controllers, because they're always arguing with me about the people that if people were really Christians, after all, they would just be cooperative. It's amazing. Yeah.
So I need to buy a car over there. So naturally.
No, I'm not going to buy it for you.
I'm got some money. Naturally, I was reading hostage negotiation text.
To buy a car?
Yeah.
Okay.
It took literally 11 and a half hours. I was there till 2 o'clock in the morning. But I got a good deal.
Yep.
Within the papers, they kept talking about try to trigger a no in the other person.
Mm-hmm.
So that way, like, if you don't give the other person an opportunity to say no, it'll build up and they'll just say no to whatever.
Right.
They will be shut off. So if you give someone an opportunity to say no, they'll be more receptive to whatever else you are trying to get them to do.
To say yes.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and get you to say no.
Mm-hmm.
Not in a super obvious way, like, hey,
oh, we wouldn't want that.
when was the last time you checked your car tire? It's like the telemarketing.
Right.
Not that, but a genuine no, so that way people will be more likely to say yes. And it was also talking about no doesn't. I'm not a rapist. They were talking about no does not mean no. It was really weird. They were talking about no isn't always a hard no. No is sometimes an opportunity for yes. Where does that fit in there?
Well, there's an embedded truth in there, and that is that if I give people the freedom to say no, they also then have the freedom to say yes. Okay. There's an embedded truth in there in that regard. But just we'll talk crisis and trauma some other time. But controllers see no as an opportunity to try to overcome, and in extreme cases, no is not meant, and therefore they can do whatever they want with impunity. But the embedded part of that is true, is that if I find a way to help people be free to say no, then that also means they're also free to say yes. Interesting fact, is that that's exactly how God operated. Because when Jesus came and paid the price for our salvation, he made it possible for us to finally get around to having a choice. And the celestial gamble was that would be compelling enough for people to say yes to. But it also means it's the freedom to say no. And we've seen people do that, right? I mean, God, that's the gamble. That's the gamble of grace. Is that the gift is big enough, presumably that would be enough for somebody to say yes to all the time. But that also means people are free to say no. And if they're free to say no, they're free to say yes. If they're free to say yes, they're free to say no. And boundaries make that clear for us. So, one last group of the controllers, the manipulative controllers. The aggressive controllers, at least they're honest. You always know where they're coming from. Manipulative controllers, you're never really sure, and they tend to manipulate your opinions in such a way so that you agree with them. In other words, they turn your no into a yes. And so they spend a lot of time manipulating circumstances so that it looks like they're only trying to be helpful, or whatever the phrase might be. So they're all about persuasion. All about persuasion. And that's the four kind of aspects that go around, or three of them. One more, and then we'll call it a day. And that's the non-responsives. And the non-responsives don't hear the needs of people. Okay? So, when we were talking about safe people, and we were talking about the first group that made a variety of people uncomfortable, the critics tend to be non-responsives. That's why they don't respond according to the other person's needs, because they don't hear their needs. And these are the folks that if you don't like how you feel, change your feelings. Life's tough. Get on it. Get on with it. The funny thing about it is that we do this to ourselves. We manage our emotions this way. We minimize them and relativize them. We do a variety of strategies that we've already talked about. The avoidance that relativize everything. See, if one strategy doesn't work to manage our emotions, we just find another one. And so they tend to have a very critical spirit. It's really all about what's putting them out rather than the needs of the person that they're responding to. And even when I say the needs of the person they're responding to, they don't hear them. They don't see them. And so therefore they don't respond to them. So, okay, I'll stop. Any questions? You dodge the bullet until next time for control. We'll see you then. I have a quiz for you, or an assessment device for you. I'm not going to send it home with you. I brought it with me, but I'm not going to let you have it. Yeah.
Can you go back to the slides?
Yes. That one?